Hi, Sam. I hope everybody can hear me. Many thanks, Sam, and the user TCP Academy for inviting me to give this webinar. It is a pleasure for me to share some of the things that I've been doing lately, and hopefully also get to know the views and knowledge that some of our participants might also have in this field. So the purpose of this presentation is twofold. First of all, I would like to provide like a common and hopefully simple understanding of behavioral energy economics. And second, I would like to share and discuss with you the main promises, lessons, and challenges in relation to sustainable energy use. So for that reason, the outline of my presentation is quite simple. I will start with the promises of behavioral energy economics. I will focus on the conceptual, theoretical aspects that lay the foundations for this field. I think that this is quite important, particularly if we want to know the promises of behavioral energy economics in relation to, obviously, energy users from a consumer perspective. I will then address the main lessons. I've selected roughly like 40 case studies, some of them not new, some of them very new, almost all of them involving RCTs, and by RCTs I mean randomized controlled trials in particular, that will hopefully provide an interesting summary of the current knowledge. Building upon many policy implications, I will then elaborate on important challenges that behavioral energy economics confronts, at least from my point of view. All right, so promises. What are the promises of behavioral energy economics? I think that in terms of aims, there are two key promises, I would say. In general, behavioral energy economics deals with the cognitive, motivational, and contextual factors that affect people's decision-making processes and resulting choices associated with the use of energy. So here, an important promise of behavioral energy economics is that it seeks to create a more realistic understanding of energy behaviors from an economic point of view, of course. And second, by improving the realism of energy behaviors, I think that behavioral energy economics aims to improve the accuracy of economic analysis, again, in relation to energy use and resulting environmental impacts, which means that behavioral energy economics aims to provide a better theoretical framework, or frameworks in plural, better predictions, and better energy policies, with a particular focus on consumer behavior. If we move on to the FOSSI of behavioral energy economics, I think that it can be divided in two specific areas. The first one is about individual factors. Sometimes in the literature they are called intrinsic factors. Here the focus is on the habits, obviously energy aspects, budget constraints, for example, but also moral concerns and the psychographics of energy users that again affect energy related decisions and outcomes. Above all, I would say great attention in this area is given to behavioral anomalies, or sometimes in the literature they're also called behavioral deviations or behavioral factors. So what do I mean by these? These are simply patterns or elements that explain why individuals, energy users, fail to behave as the rational choice theory predicts. Or basically, as one colleague of mine argues, why we make systematic errors that compromise our own interests related to energy use. I will provide a number of examples about this in my next slide, but for the moment, please bear with me. This is just one specific focus of behavioral energy economics. So the things that are in our little heads, as I often say. And the second area relates to contextual factors. A fundamental postulate in behavioral energy economics, like in behavioral economics in general, I would say, is that decisions are context specific. And decisions also vary over time. In addition, and probably more importantly, we don't really know that well our own preferences, which leave us, energy users, susceptible to contextual influencers. And I think that all of you might be familiar that the way in which choices are contextualized has been shown to be quite important in a variety of decision settings. We will talk about social norms, social comparison, because that is one, let's say, remarkable example of behavioral energy economics in this area. Within contextual factors, we also find structural issues, which in the case of sustainable energy use can be quite important. For example, the availability of active mobility infrastructure, or how energy markets are designed or regulated can have an important impact on the way that we use energy. So as I mentioned before, one important focus of behavioral energy economics relates to these intrinsic or individual factors, and in particular behavioral anomalies or behavioral deviations. These are important barriers from a behavioral point of view. The ones that you can see on the slide there are the ones that I consider to be the most important, or the ones that are, let's say, highly or commonly addressed by the literature. The identification of these anomalies is another important promise of behavioral energy economics. And this is also quite important because this will lead us actually to the potential identification of choice interventions. So very quickly going through all of these anomalies, heuristics, these are basically rules of thumb. They're just simplified or intuitive decision-making rules that, as you may know, often lead to immediate, but often, unfortunately, suboptimal choices or incorrect outcomes. Then we have choice overload. This is basically the difficulty that individuals have in making a choice when presented with too many options. And this is a little bit opposed to traditional neoclassical economics that, as you may know, assumes basically that more choices are always better than fewer choices. Then we have limited attention. This is another, let's say, common type of anomaly found in the behavioral energy economics literature. This is a cognitive constraint, often defined, at least in psychology or environmental psychology, to be more precise, as the limited rate by which the brain can process information. Loss aversion. This is the tendency to place greater value on relative losses than relative gains. A status quo bias, basically this is a preference for the current state of affairs. People tend to resist change, I guess, and sometimes go with the flow of preset options. Here, the power of the status quo bias or the power of inertia can increase if the decision is too complex, too difficult, or involve too many options. And finally, the other type of anomaly that becomes a barrier for sustainable energy use is procrastination. This is often understood as postponing something unnecessarily, which unfortunately can lead individuals to delay decisions, failure to act, or the acceptance of the status quo. So now let us talk about choice intervention and the way that behavioral energy economics evaluates or assesses this choice intervention. Unfortunately, I would say that there is no single definition of behavioral energy economics oriented interventions. In the public discourse, however, these interventions are often presented as, nudges. However, I think that this is not a very useful, let's say, type of categorization in my view, particularly from analytical and policy design issues. We can discuss that during the Q&A session. But here, the taxonomy that I would like to use is the one given by Robert Mundaca and colleagues from Heidelberg University. They basically postulate three categories of choice interventions. The first one is about decision information. These are choice interventions that cover the way the information is presented to energy users or decision makers and how this subsequently influences their choices. Example, feedback and social comparison, and I'm going to be given a lot of specific cases about these two types of decision information choice interventions. The second category relates to decision assistance. These are interventions that aim to further support energy users so they can follow through their intended actions or intended choices, you might say. And the final category is decision structure. So these are choice interventions that cover the arrangement or preparation of energy use choices, and of course, related decision-making formats. And here we find choice defaults or framing type of interventions. Again, in the second part of my presentation, I will provide a number of examples related to that. Okay, so that is a taxonomy regarding choice interventions that are often designed, implemented, and assessed in this field. The question is, what kind of evaluation criteria do we apply to assess them? And here I think that the literature is also quite straightforward. We often use two evaluation criteria: effectiveness. This is basically whether interventions are able to meet intended outcomes. You can say in terms of energy savings, reductions in peak demand, or the market uptake of green electricity. And then the second evaluation criterion relates to persistence. So basically, this refers to whether the interventions, the choice interventions that are implemented, are able to maintain the outcomes in the long term. This is the framework, both in terms of taxonomy of choice interventions and then in terms of assessment criteria, that I will use in order to frame the second part of my presentation. So from a theoretical point of view, I would like to say that behavioral energy economics is an expanding and dynamic discipline. Here, I will not go into all the specific details. I don't think that this is an academic type of presentation. The only thing that I will mention is that once you get familiar with this field, you can see that it's anchored around four main pillars, namely prospect theory, intertemporal choice, normative behavior, and cognitive science. The key point that I want to make here with this slide is that, well, first of all, behavioral energy economics is not new. It's not a unified kind of theory, but I would argue that it's a growing collection of concepts, analytical tools, and ideas. That's the key point that I want to make, particularly from a theoretical point of view. Then if we move from theory to analytical framework, if we put all together the aims, the FOSSI, behavioral anomalies, etc., this is the type of main analytical framework that behavioral energy economics often uses or applies to support policy making. Sometimes in the literature, this kind of analytical framework is called the logic model. Sometimes I prefer to call it the intervention model. But the whole point is that this model aims to support the design, analysis, and evaluation of choice intervention. I think that explicitly or implicitly, the literature widely uses this kind of analytical framework, and it has five building blocks. We already talked about the anomalies, we already talked about choice interventions, but there are other elements here, mediators. This element basically aims to explain the relationship between P, which is the policy intervention, and O, which is the outcome. What do I mean by outcome? This is in the literature often understood as the response to the policy intervention by subject participants, energy users, of course. And then we have impacts, depicted here by the letter I, which again in the literature is often defined as the resulting changes generated by the outcomes on the society and the environment. Even if this analytical framework might look quite static or linear to you, let me tell you that this is not the case, certainly not in my experience. There are plenty of feedback loops, is very iterative and is very dynamic. So please keep that in mind. I think that just for the purpose of this presentation, I prefer to present it in this way. All right, then. So the other point that I wanted to make here is that this analytical framework, at least in my view, summarizes some of the main promises of behavioral energy economics. One very big promise is that it aims to understand energy use behavior. That means that behavioral energy economics aims at identifying factors influencing energy consumption, exploring psychological drivers behind, of course, energy-related choices, and predicting or explaining energy consumption patterns. And the second main task is to, as I said before, design, implement, and assess choice intervention. That is basically trying to bring behavioral insights for developing targeted policy interventions and evaluating and improving the performance of those in order to assist policymakers. So with that in mind, let us now focus on the lessons. As I said in the beginning, I would like to go very quickly through roughly 40 specific examples that I've collected for you, some of them relatively old, back from the 70s, but other quite new, recently published. But there are two things that I really would like you to keep in mind. First, behavioral energy economics is not new. One can easily identify applications over the last 40 years. Maybe at that time, the field wasn't framed in this way, but when it comes to applications, choice interventions, and some of the policy recommendations, from my view, this field is certainly not new. And second, perhaps, and more importantly, is that, as I will show, the evidence actually is quite mixed. So generalizations should be avoided, even though I'm going to be making a lot of generalizations, but please take them with due caution. So, as I said, I will follow exactly the same taxonomy and those specific evaluation criteria in order to present the lessons learned. So let us start with the first domain, decision information, simplified feedback. For those of you that are in the field of energy efficiency, this particular example shouldn't be new to you. This application of behavioral energy economics aims to simplify the presentation of useful information to energy users, or basically limit the number or complexity of options within a given decision framework. It is, to the best of my knowledge, based on, let's say, the grand assumption that better and simplified information will support better decision making. It has been widely used in utility-driven demand response programs. And basically, it involves the provision of information on, for example, energy use, dynamic pricing, or specific energy efficiency measures. Simplified feedback can also be delivered via multiple channels, all the way from smart metering to time of use tariffs or to personalized energy efficiency tips. So what is the experience telling us? When it comes to the effectiveness, first of all, this is often measured in terms of energy savings or reductions in peak demand, obviously compared to a control group that is not subject to this kind of intervention. As you can see here, the evidence is, as I said before, quite mixed. By the way, in the squared brackets, I took the liberty to add the countries in which these studies have taken place. I think that this is quite important when I will start addressing some of the challenges that this field confronts. But the main point here is that, well, in certain cases, the effectiveness is 0, while in others, in certain meta-analysis, for instance, this has been estimated to be in the range of 5 to 20%. So the persistence, so whether or not the outcomes or these effects can be maintained in the long term, are often unknown, I would say, if we put together all this knowledge. Basically, it is unclear whether the effects are maintained over time. However, when persistence is actually measured, some studies show that this can either decrease or increase. So you can see the findings going in opposite direction. So what can we learn from a policy point of view? Well, taken all together, I think that the experience shows that feedback can be effective in helping energy users to use energy more sustainably, but not in all cases. The body of knowledge shows that much more research is needed to explore how and for whom simplified feedback is most effective. When you also review the knowledge out there, you will notice that we need to better understand the underlying psychological determinants behind these outcomes. So the mediators, the mechanisms that I show in the analytical framework. Now let us move on to social comparison, another type of choice intervention within the decision information domain. This is a special type of feedback, I would say, that often refers to the process of giving energy users information about their energy use in relation to the use of compatible households. From a pure behavioral economics point of view, I think that this is quite relevant or quite important because many people exhibit reference-dependent preferences. That means that social norms can constitute a reference point. Social comparison in the energy field also aims to trigger competition, or at least feelings of competition, and some kind of social pressure as well. Here you can see two examples on your left-hand side. The most well-known, perhaps, the home energy reports in the US implemented by Power. I don't know, I remember perhaps back in the 2007 or something like that. And the other one comes from Sweden, actually from my own electricity supplier, in which my electricity use is compared to different type of households. The average one and the most efficient ones. So what is the evidence telling us? Again, I would repeat this, the evidence is again quite mixed. If you pay attention there to the upper bullet points, some studies consistently find relatively small effects, or let's say insignificant evidence associated to this type of intervention, while others estimate savings in the range of 1% up to 30%, again, depending on the geographical context in which these interventions are implemented. If I can generalize here, but again, please take this with due caution, I think that the studies with high samples, I would say above 50,000 or 80,000, often find smaller effects. And by smaller effects, I mean those in the range of 1 to 2%. Persistence, I think that there are some very positive indications from Opower. And why do I mention Opower in particular? Because it has a relatively important treatment group, above 30,000 households. So it's a very powered sample. And if we go into the specific, I would say that social comparisons tend to work well if and only if they are supported by simplified feedback, which is pretty good, but then things get slightly more complex because the attribution of effects is slightly more difficult to allocate. Lessons, for sure, I think that there is cost-effective potential for this. Actually, again, there are pretty good indications from the experience in the US, again, in relation to Opower. However, I think that much more attention is needed on consumption patterns, particularly regarding rebound or boomerang effects. That is, for example, whether low-intensity energy users might increase their energy use as a result of this comparison. And from my kind of knowledge, also there is a strong need for long-term analysis. In particular, we need to question whether energy users change their habits, use new technologies, or both. Now, if we move on to the next domain of choice interventions, that is decision assistant. And here in particular, I would like to talk about the commitment and goal setting. Commitment devices are a set of interventions that allow energy users to lock themselves today into the action or behaviors, energy behaviors, they want to adopt tomorrow. So, for example, commitment can take the form of an oral or written pledge or promise to change behavior with the aim to conserve energy, of course, or use energy more efficiently. Commitment in the literature is often, not always, but often combined with a goal that aims to provide like a concrete reference point. So a household or a given energy user explicitly promises to reduce energy use by, let's say, 10% or 20%. As a whole, I think that these choice interventions provide a source of motivation for individuals. It compares the present situation with a desired future state. So what is the experience telling us? Again, the evidence is quite mixed. Sometimes when the goal is, in the range of 0 to 15%, we see studies estimating energy savings in the range of 11%. If we go to the upper values, that means when the goal is set in the proximity of 25%, then savings are estimated to be in the range of 19%. So I think that persistence in this case, again, from my point of view, is a little bit interesting, because sometimes even if there is no effectiveness in the short term, some studies have identified energy savings in the long term, which is a little bit puzzling. Why? Because sometimes we can discuss to what extent other factors have also affected those energy behaviors, for example, and obviously those specific results. Policy lessons, I think that taken all together, results point to an interesting energy conservation and energy efficiency potentials. I would dare to say in the proximity of 10%. However, I think that this area requires much more research. For example, if goals are realistic, then we need to question whether these goals are relevant from a policy perspective, because we might be just replicating business as usual scenarios. In addition, some studies also test or apply commitment and goals with simplified feedback, which adds a little bit of complexity and uncertainty to the attribution of effects. And some studies in particular, I think, that exhibit a lot of methodological shortcomings, notably very small samples, sometimes in the range of 10 to 15 individuals. So I think that it is possible, or it is safe to say that we cannot rule out that many of the insignificant results that one might find in the literature might be due to underpowered samples, actually. Moving on to decision structure domain, and here in particular, I would like to focus on green energy defaults. I believe that some of you at least are kind of familiar with these. They are understood as a decision structure type of intervention that seeks or aims to determine the outcome if energy users do not actively choose their electricity mix supply. Why? Well, because from behavioral economics, we know that there is growing evidence that shows that decision makers are disproportionately drawn towards default options. This means that changing the default can change a large proportion of the decisions, while at the same time, and this is very important, we are in the position to maintain the freedom of choice. The default choice in this case is the option that a consumer selects if he or she doesn't do anything. So what you can see there on the screen is what I would call a normal or a standard decision-making scenario, in which the default choice is the gray electricity, the one that comes from a variety of energy carriers or energy sources, including both renewable and non-renewable energy sources. So if the energy users wants to choose green electricity, then obviously he or she has to opt in. However, under a green energy default, the situation is slightly different. The green electricity is the default option. So if the energy users does not want to have green electricity, he or she has to actively opt out. I would summarize that this intervention has been explored mostly in liberalized energy markets, where users can actually choose among different suppliers, and or suppliers are in the position to offer different electricity mixes. This might be quite familiar for us living here in Europe, but in other continents, trust me, this might not be necessarily the case. So what are the main outcomes? What are the main lessons? Here again, let me repeat myself, the evidence is actually a little bit mixed. If we look at the effectiveness, and in particular, if we look at lab experiments, we can notice that the choice for green electricity is often higher under the green default scenario compared to the gray standard energy default, which is a number that you can see in parentheses. But this is obviously not across all cases. Now, that experience from lab experiments need to be compared to what we know from natural experiments. And here the situation is slightly different, because the level of effectiveness is much, much higher. 99% in the case of Germany, for instance, and 80% in the case of Switzerland. So you can see certain disagreement, or to some extent at least, a degree of inconsistency between the type of experiment that we carry out. In terms of persistence, and then looking at, in particular, natural experiments, I would say that yes, effects remain for about 4 to 6 years, again, depending on the geographical context here, but they are very highly dependent on the contract tariff agreements. So that agreement, the extension of that, might determine actually the persistence of this intervention. Lessons, in my view, I think that there is very high potential. Particular, again, let me stress, evidence from natural experiments is quite significant, but experience, unfortunately, is still concentrated in a very handful number of countries that, in my view, they all have relatively highly liberalized energy markets, and energy users might have a relatively high environmental awareness and relatively high disposable income. So it comes from let's say, a very particular set of countries. So the question here is that there might be numerous factors that we need to understand, particularly in other social market and policy context. Okay, so that was, in, I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes, a little bit, a summary of what behavioral energy economics have been able to produce over the last 40 years or so. So now let us talk about the challenges. And here I will focus on overall policy implications that one can extrapolate or discuss from this intervention. And as I highlight some of the policy implications, I will also identify some specific challenges that the practice of behavioral energy economics confronts in reality, again, according to my view. So what are the direct policy implications, and what are the challenges that can be derived from this current, let's say, body of knowledge? At the risk of stating the obvious, I think that the experience confirms that energy-related decisions are driven by behavioral, social, and structural factors beyond pricing. At the same time, I think that the experience shows that all these factors can be influenced by policy. So to me, I think that a key and fundamental question is whether behavioral energy economics is in the position to lead to incremental or radical behavior changes that can decisively steer sustainable energy use. Second issue relates to the sustainability of interventions over the long term. I think that this is another challenge. Persistence, as you probably understood, is a clear horizontal challenge that arises when reviewing the experience. Relatively speaking, I would say that we know well what happens in the short term, but not that much what happens in the long run. Setting aside resources, obviously, to follow up these interventions, I think that we still need to understand what works best for whom and who benefits most from such choice interventions in the long run. Then we go to the issue of heterogeneity. I think that they are important between study differences, and this really underscores a variety of issues, including the specific design of the interventions, obviously methodological issues, energy users, and other psychographics and economic motivational aspects, but obviously the different contexts in which these interventions take place. To me, an important challenge in this area is how to study these interventions in heterogeneous yet generalizable samples. Another important element here relates to the effectiveness. I think that we can agree that there is potential there, but if we move away from effectiveness, from pure effectiveness, but then into some economic aspects, I think that the evidence suggests some, let's say, cost-effective reduction of energy, or cost-effective promotion of green electricity. However, and with due exceptions, of course, I think that estimates about the cost effectiveness need to be produced, even if one can assume that these interventions are relatively cheap and compare well against other policies. I think that this is quite important to avoid sometimes the mistaken interpretation that behavioral interventions might be costless, which is sometimes not the case. I also think that much more emphasis also needs to be given to economic efficiency. Again, kind of going into the more specifically into the economic area, and that is whether these interventions do or not maximize the net benefits for the society. When it comes to synergies and improvements of what I call traditional policy instruments, I think that experience shows that interventions can be used to improve the design of existing regulation. I think that energy billing has become a classic example. However, most of these interventions are analyzed in isolation, so much more is needed to analyze how behavioral energy interventions perform in relation to a portfolio of policy instruments that obviously can vary over time. Pricing mechanisms for sure should not be ruled out. So the main challenge here is how to maximize the complementarities and synergies between price and non-price policy intervention. And finally, ethical aspects. I think that this can be also brought up during the Q&A. I think that for policymakers, utility, obviously, as scholars, the usual question is whether individuals are being manipulated into making unwanted choices. I think that for energy users, if you look at the literature, there is a lot of arguments about unintended side effects. Moral licensing is one of them. That means that when people allow themselves to do something bad after doing something good, like saving energy. So there are many ethical issues there that can be unpacked. I'm heading towards the end of my presentation now. So there might be a number of challenges now that can be extrapolated from some of what I call indirect policy implications. Let me very quickly go through them. The first thing is that it is still, unfortunately, unknown to what extent behavioral insights are or not really incorporated in energy policy design and implementation. Of course, we can speculate that this influence is high because in many countries, and you know this much better than me, US, UK, Australia, there are many initiatives on this subject. However, there is a need to understand how and to what extent policymakers are truly considering behavioral insights into energy and, why not, climate policy. Transparency, I think, and accountability are quite important challenges in this area. The role of evidence-based evaluation, I think that the experience underscores the value of evidence-based evaluation, studies to support policymaking. I think that this is crucial, particularly potentially before large-scale implementation. The challenge, though, that I see here is whether public agencies, let alone funding organizations, are willing to support this process. Another challenge relates to the contribution of behavioral energy economics, and I think that this can go beyond the nudges in particular. I think that we can provide a better understanding of policy problems. We can provide better empirical, methodological assessment about policy instruments in general, with a particular focus on behavioral issues. And then perhaps more importantly, I think that we can understand the black box of decision making. Remember these mechanisms or mediators that I show in the intervention model. And then I think that much more attention needs to be put to side effects, well-being, and organizations. As you probably noticed, pretty much all of these interventions are directed to individuals and not organizations. And by organizations here, I mean, you know, utilities, banks, large corporations, and so on. In addition, I think that welfare issues have been often overlooked. However, they are very crucial to increase the value of behavioral energy economics to improve policy. And let us not forget that welfare issues are certainly needed to get the attention of policy makers. I think that all of this underscores the role of policymakers. I think that it's time for policymakers, market regulators to define a set of principles and guidelines addressing the design, implementation, and assessment of behavioral issues in policy interventions, including, of course, ethical aspect. So, concluding remarks very quickly. Behavioral energy economics has shown promise, I would say, in identifying and overcoming barriers to sustainable energy use. Experimental research has been central to this, but again, generalizations should be avoided. External validity is still an issue, and we need to better understand mediators are really underlying the mechanisms driving policy outcomes. In addition, most of the experience is still confined to utility-driven or research-oriented initiatives. So we can question to what extent really we can expect this to be mainstream in public policy. Then I think that the importance of choice architectures, and value of policy experimentation and evaluation are quite clear. However, this knowledge is heavily concentrated in OECD countries. So we still need to know more what is taking place or might take place beyond the US and in particular and the European Union. I always wonder to what extent what is the potential in countries in which electricity markets are not liberalized, or how behavioral energy economics interventions perform in countries in which there is a weak or underdeveloped energy policy mix. Interventions offer potential, but they're not the panacea. I think that price mechanisms are still important. Policy interventions, I would say in this regard, are unlikely to be a silver bullet. And what we need is a very ambitious policy mix. And finally, I think that there are challenges related to scalability, long-term behavior change, remember persistence, equity, quite important in my view, and the need for interdisciplinary collaboration. I think that the experience stresses that much more work is needed in connecting behavioral energy economics with a just energy and climate neutral transition. Policymakers and behavioral scientists need to work much more closely together. And I believe that rigorous policy assessment and improved communication for sure are crucial to bridge this science policy gap. And with that, I would like to thank you and hand over to Sam.